All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at the US Constitution, but we're going to completely ditch the idea of it being some dusty, centuries-old list of rules. Instead, think of it as an incredibly dynamic, living blueprint for balancing power. This document is literally the foundational architecture of the American government. And the reason this matters right now, today, is because this isn't just history. This blueprint actively draws the lines of what our government can and absolutely cannot do, which affects our daily lives. It's a system brilliantly engineered to be highly functional but strictly contained.
Now, here is the massive headache that was literally keeping the Founding Fathers up at night at the Constitutional Convention. They had just fought a war to get away from a king, right? So they were absolutely terrified of power getting concentrated into the hands of one person or a small group. But on the flip side, their previous setup, the Articles of Confederation, was dangerously weak. Like, couldn't collect taxes, couldn't raise an army weak. So they were walking this incredibly tightrope, trying to forge a government muscular enough to survive, but fragmented enough to prevent a dictatorship.
To see exactly how they pulled off this architectural miracle, we're going to walk through our agenda. Separating and sharing power, the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and finally, changing the Constitution.
Okay, Section 1, Separating and Sharing Power, the Master Plan. Let's look at how the framers deliberately engineered friction into the system, because they actually wanted passing laws to be a bit of a struggle.
Borrowing a brilliant idea from Enlightenment thinker Baron de Montesquieu, they decided no single branch should run the whole show. By dividing power fundamentally across different institutions, they made sure that the people making the laws, enforcing the laws, and interpreting the laws weren't all living in the same house. At a time when most of the globe was ruled by absolute monarchs, this was a wildly radical idea.
But here is the real genius twist. They didn't put these branches in total isolation. Instead of a strict separation, they created what you can think of as separated institutions sharing powers. They are locked in this permanent, constitutional tug-of-war, where every branch has a specific tool to block the others from taking full control.
Just take a look at how tangled these responsibilities are. A president can negotiate a major foreign treaty setting the global agenda, but it means absolutely nothing unless the Senate actually uses its power to ratify it. The legislative branch writes the laws, sure, but the executive can veto them right back. It is a masterpiece of shared competing authority that practically forces compromise.
And to water down that central power even further, they threw federalism into the mix. This is the sharing of power between the national government and the individual states. Federalism is just as central to our system's DNA as checks and balances, and it's why things like marijuana laws or education standards can look completely different the second you cross a state line. Because that boundary between state and federal power is always shifting, it's still a huge source of debate today.
So what this entire overlapping maze actually means for you and me is access. It creates multiple access points. If you can't get a policy passed in one branch, you can just pivot and knock on another door. When Congress was dragging its feet on civil rights in the 1950s, advocates bypassed them and took their fight to the federal courts. When gay rights activists wanted marriage equality, they started state by state before ever taking it to the Supreme Court. The system is literally built to give citizens multiple pathways to push for change.
Moving right along to Section 2, the legislative branch, the lawmakers. Found in Article 1, this branch's whole reason for existing is to legislate, to make the laws of the land.
Now, they set up a bicameral, or two-house system, and these two houses have completely different personalities by design. The House of Representatives is on a short 2-year leash, meant to react incredibly fast to whatever the voters want right now. The Senate, though, with its 6-year staggered terms, it's built to chill things out. There's this famous story, maybe a bit of a myth, but it makes the point, where George Washington describes the Senate as the saucer you pour your hot tea into to cool it down. Since only a third of the Senate is up for re-election at any time, a sudden shift in public mood can't just upend national policy overnight.
If you really want to understand how Congress flexes its power today, you've got to grasp this one distinction, the difference between expressed and implied powers. Expressed powers are the ones explicitly written out in ink, like collecting taxes. But implied powers, that's the invisible muscle Congress uses to significantly expand its reach and tackle modern issues the founders couldn't have even dreamed of.
And where does that invisible muscle come from? The Necessary and Proper Clause, perfectly nicknamed the Elastic Clause. This little piece of text is the ultimate stretch-to-fit mechanism. It's what lets the federal government actually adapt and regulate things in our massive, highly complex modern economy.
Okay, Section 3, the executive branch, the enforcer.
Laid out in Article 2, this branch gives us a single president with a 4-year term, and their job is to actually execute the laws Congress writes.
Sure, the president commands a massive federal bureaucracy, but notice the catch on every single one of these powers. They are all directly checked by the legislative branch. A president can veto a bill, but Congress can just override it if they get a 2/3 vote. The president is commander-in-chief? Absolutely. But only Congress has the actual power to declare war and write the checks to fund it. It's that tug of war we talked about, in action.
Honestly, so much of how the presidency works today is just built on precedent, and George Washington set the biggest one of all. Even though the original rules didn't have term limits, he could have stayed forever, he voluntarily walked away after his second term. Handing over power peacefully like that, it established a massive standard that defined the American presidency for centuries.
Section 4. The Judicial Branch, the Interpreters. This is Article 3, and what's wild is that the framers left this part surprisingly blank. They created a Supreme Court and basically told Congress, hey, you guys figure out the rest of the lower courts.
But one thing they did make crystal clear is the Supremacy Clause over in Article 6. This essentially says the Constitution and national laws are the supreme law of the land, period. It makes federal courts superior to state courts when it comes to national policy. Without this rule, any of the 50 states could just ignore the federal government, and the whole blueprint would instantly collapse.
And here is a crazy piece of historical irony. The Supreme Court's absolute most powerful tool, judicial review, which is their ability to strike down laws as unconstitutional, isn't even in the original text. They literally gave that power to themselves years after the founding, in the famous 1803 case Marbury v. Madison.
Finally, Section 5. Changing the Constitution, the upgrade system. The framers were smart enough to know society would evolve, so Article 5 is the built-in upgrade mechanic. But, staying true to their fear of instability, they made upgrading this thing an absolute nightmare.
Check out the massive hurdles required for just one change. 2 grueling steps, proposal and ratification. You need huge supermajorities at both the national and state levels. It effectively means a tiny handful of states can completely derail an amendment that the rest of the entire country desperately wants.
Because it's so incredibly tough, out of thousands of proposed changes since the country started, only 27 amendments have ever actually made it through. 27. And think about this. The first 10 are the Bill of Rights, which happened almost immediately. Plus, 2 amendments about alcohol just cancel each other out. So realistically, we've only had about 15 lasting, structural changes in over 2 centuries.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to chew on. If the original blueprint was so heavily tilted toward a shared, heavily checked legislative branch, how exactly did modern presidents in the courts end up wielding the immense power they hold today? The blueprint built the foundation, but man, history and interpretation have completely remodeled the house we live in.